Was the winner of the Wen Zhen Book Prize of the National Library of China, and his work has been selected for many anthologies. In addition, he's a journalist that many of you have read his work in New York Times, Atlantic, Discover, Vanity Fair. He's a senior radio producer for Homeland Productions, and he lives in beautiful Western Massachusetts. We're also really delighted to welcome back Jackie Judd. Jackie is one of our favorite moderators. Many of you know Jackie from her early years with ABC TV, where she was a correspondent. She has spent the last decade with Kaiser Family Foundation working on a number of their global health issues. She's received numerous awards, including the Edward R. Murrow Award, and she's currently a writer and an independent consultant and a friend to the Aspen Institute. So I'd like to turn it over to Jackie to begin our conversation, and thank all of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Peggy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it. Alan, welcome to you.
Thanks.
As Peggy suggested, this is a trickier issue than one might think. And having said that, I'd like you to describe to the audience why you decided to take this on, why you decided this book needed to be written, to give us the context.
Sure. Some of you may know my last book, The World Without Us. For those of you who don't, suffice it to say that I wrote it because I really want a world with us. The idea was theoretically to remove us from the planet and show, as my research revealed, that nature would recover from a lot of our damages with surprising swiftness, eventually refill empty niches, would really flourish again without the daily pressures that we heap on it. But what I really wanted was for readers to look at that and think, wow, that's so beautiful. Isn't there some way that we can add ourselves back to a healthy, renewed planet, only in harmony rather than in the constant combat that we seem to be locked into now with the rest of nature? But in looking at how to quantify what it is that we do, as I raised this point in the epilogue, I ran into a pretty disturbing fact. You know, we see all these numbers, billions and billions in population. It's very hard for our minds to grasp that. But thanks to the invention of the calculator, I could do the long division and put it into something that's graspable. And it turns out that every 4 to 4.5 days, we have been and we continue to add 1 million more people to the planet, which just did not sound like a very sustainable number to me. So at the end of the book, unexpectedly to myself, I ended up doing another little thought experiment. Setting all social concerns aside, I inquired, what would happen if we all participated in the Chinese one-child policy? And I asked the Demographic Institute in Vienna, a very distinguished institute, if they knew, and they crunched the numbers for me, and it turns out that by the end of the century, our population would drop after a couple generations precipitously, and we'd be down to 1.6 billion people, which is exactly what the population was of the world in 1900 before suddenly it doubled and then doubled again. We quadrupled in 1 century. Now, nobody likes the Chinese one-child policy, including most of the Chinese. Nevertheless, I left this question dangling at the end of The World Without Us. Should we be thinking about population? Because everything else that we're trying to do to control our environmental impact on the planet, frankly, doesn't seem to be working very well. And I found that readers really wanted to get into this question. In every venue, including I was on Catholic radio programs and spoke to Mormon audiences, and I didn't get the blowback for this that I was expecting. But it is a very loaded topic, and when I proposed to my agent this would be should be my next book, he said, no, don't touch that, you know. This one is really a live wire. But I couldn't come up with anything else. And so I started writing it. And
you set out to answer, well, if not answer, at least explore 4 questions.
Yeah.
What are those 4 questions?
Yeah, I put this in the book proposal, and ultimately this turned into the reason why a publisher fronted me to do this thing. The 4 questions, which I ended up asking in 21 countries around the world, were, 1, how many people can fit on this planet without capsizing it? Number two, kind of the converse of that, how much nature do we need to preserve to guarantee our own survival? Can we even know which species are essential to us that we don't want to push off the edge of the planet, as we have so many already? Number three, if the Chinese policy is that unpalatable, is there something in the cultures, the histories, the liturgies of the majority of the world's other religions, political systems, nationalities, whatever, that might, so to speak, embrace the idea of refraining from embracing so much in times of need? And lo and behold, I did find a lot. The fourth question is, if we have to stop growing or even shrink back to an optimum, how do we design an economy that can prosper, that doesn't depend on endless growth, which is what we always hear of as being the definition of economic health? So that kept me busy for a while.
I saw that as I was reading the book. And as the question suggests, you take a very holistic approach to the issues that you're tackling. Population control or population management may be a better phrase. And I'm wondering, as you traveled the globe, if you found that you interviewed what we in journalism would call real people, and then you interviewed the experts. And I'm wondering if the experts you met with, environmentalists, for example, did they approach the issue in a holistic way? Were they looking at population issues in the way that you did?
Well,
or were they in silos, which is something Washington knows about?
Well, I mean, frankly, there are very few environmental groups that touch this. And that is because they tend to be concerned that this being such a hot topic, and frankly, I've discovered that the topic, the sensitivity to this topic is oftentimes more in their minds than it is in actuality. But they're concerned that whatever their mission is might get diverted into a struggle, say with the Catholic Church or whatever, over an issue that really isn't their central issue. Ecologists, on the other hand, get this everywhere I went. I mean, even in China, I traveled in China for about a month, and much of that with ecologists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They simply said, look, the one-child policy, of course, that was painful, but look, we had just had a famine. We'd gone through, we killed 40 million people, and granted, some of that was government ineptitude, but a lot of it was they simply had exceeded their carrying capacity. And they said, if we hadn't have done the one-child policy, there'd be 400 million more Chinese. Now, they were showing me the world's most expensive environmental mitigation project, trying to put back the trees that had been cut by those overgrown generation of Chinese farmers, $40 billion to do that. And they say, if it hadn't have been for the one-child policy, there would be no ecosystem left in China. So I guess one environmental group, Center for Biological Diversity, which is really based around ecology, has population as one of their mission planks, but very few others do.
One of the fascinating things about this book, in my view, is that you make us look at countries that we think we as Americans understand. But we happen to understand them through a very narrow prism. And the best example of that probably is Iran. You travel to Iran and you tell us a very, to my mind again, surprising and interesting story about that country's success with population management.
Yeah.
Talk to us about it.
Okay, first of all, there really is a difference between population management and population control. I came out of this book deciding that population control is simply the wrong way to go, because most people don't want to be controlled over such, particularly when it involves such a natural act. We were discussing before, like every organism, we're designed to make copies of ourselves. So any limitation on that feels literally unnatural. And plus, control, on something so intimate as reproduction, nobody wants the government climbing into their bedroom telling them what to do. Iran made the decision to go for population management. Now, the reason that they had to was after their 1979 Islamic Revolution. First, they kind of apply, if there's any coercion in their program, it was applied in the other way. The Ayatollah asked every fertile woman in Iran to do her patriotic duty and get pregnant because they'd been invaded by Saddam Hussein. There was an oil-rich province on the border that, just like he would do in Kuwait 10 years later, he invaded to try to grab it because the new government in Iran wasn't really organized yet. And he had the backing of NATO, sophisticated weaponry, even materials for nerve gas were being provided to him, and Iran just had bodies. So the Ayatollah wanted these women to help build a, quote, 20 million man army to fight off the invaders. And they managed to hold Iraq to a stalemate for 8 years. But at the end of the war, when a truce was finally declared, the economist who was head of planning and budget for Iran realized that they were going to have a tremendous problem. There were going to be so many kids who were going to grow up and need jobs that their economy couldn't possibly provide for all of them. And he warned the Ayatollah that having a huge population of underemployed or unemployed, frustrated young men, they were going to turn into angry young men, and this was going to destabilize the country. I mean, basically describing what today is Pakistan, which is another country that I went to. So the Ayatollah agreed to family planning, and then he died, and the present Ayatollah took over. And what they did was really 4 things. First of all, issued a fatwa saying that there's nothing in the Quran that says when wisdom dictates that you have the number of children that you can responsibly care for, that you can't use any form of birth control, all the way up to an operation for either a male or a female. Second, they made this stuff available throughout the country. I interview a woman in this book, very devout Muslim OBGYN in Tehran, who described to me the horseback brigades that they used to go on to these little villages in the farthest corners of Iran, bringing surgical tools, condoms, and everything in between, injections, pills, whatever. Third, they told people, have as many children as you want to have. It's your decision. The only thing that was compulsory was premarital classes, which, by the way, is a good idea for anybody. The Quakers do it here in the United States. And among other things they talked about in those classes, well, what to expect in marriage was how much does it cost to feed, clothe, educate a child. And the fourth, and this is really the linchpin of the program, they encouraged women to keep studying, to stay in school. Turns out everywhere I went, rich country, poor country, a woman who's in school tends to defer her childbearing until her studies are over. And then she's got something useful, interesting, economically helpful to her family that she can do. But it's very hard to exercise those, use those skills if you got 7 kids clinging to you. So today, 60% of university students in Iran are female. And as a result, Iran came down to replacement rate. That's 2 people having 2 children, in a sense, replacing themselves, a year faster than China did. It was a totally voluntary program.
Wasn't there also a financial disincentive for women to have large families in Iran? Didn't the government drop the 3rd or 4th child payment?
I believe you are right. The book is very thick, and I don't have it all memorized. I started out this book in Israel and Palestine.
Right.
I mean, what could be more of a hotbed for this thing? Because you got 2 populations trying to outpopulate each other for one country. Largely, it's a sandbox. And at one point, even Netanyahu finally puts the kibosh on yet a bigger incentive for for children, the more children
Well,
that you have.
I may be mixing it up. But
No. Actually, this did happen in Iran. In Iran, you used to get a coupon book for every new child, and they did start limiting the number of coupon books.
What about
after 4?
What happened in Iran can be replicated elsewhere?
Well,
and should it?
One of the reasons I went to so many places is that there are many different kinds of cultures, and you have to find something that is culturally appropriate for every country, something in their own history that embraces this idea. I think the one concept that is replicable is you make contraception available and you make it attractive to people to consider using it. Offering female education 9 times out of 9 seems to do it. You know, I mentioned Pakistan, and Pakistan's really scary. It's the scariest chapter in this book, frankly, because it is out of control. I mean, there was mayhem in the streets all the time I was there, and you know, this is a country right now of nearly 190 million people, and it's about the size of Texas, which has 26 million people. And by the middle of the century, it's going to have nearly 400 million people. And you know, the United States only has 315 million right now. I mean, and it's still going to be the size of Texas. So it's really out of control. But in the midst of the horrors that I saw there, not just numbers, but a lot of violence, a couple of guys I went to interview environmentalists who were trying to save the mangrove forests around Karachi Harbor. I got there a day late because they were found tortured and murdered and floating in the harbor because they were killed by a timber mafia who wanted those mangroves. But in the midst of that, only 3 miles away from there, I went to visit a school. It's part of something called the Citizens Foundation, which was started by 5 businessmen in Pakistan who got totally sick of watching their country go down the tubes. And their kids, they would say the teacher only shows up on payday. So finally, they just decided to start their own school system in the poorest parts of the country. And among the one that I went to, it was such a conservative area that they couldn't talk about family planning. But what they do is when the girls, and it's coeducational, they want boys and girls growing up next to each other so they respect each other. Only female teachers, so people will send their daughters to a school. But when they get into secondary school, they pair all the kids with mentors in a profession they think they might want to exercise someday. So girls pick nurses, woman doctor, school teacher, flight attendant. And the one thing that all those professions have in common is that the women tend to have 2 children or fewer because you can't be those things if you have too many kids. And that's how the message gets across. You know, I asked
Did you find a greater willingness among women than men to have smaller families as you traveled the world?
Oh, absolutely. You know, most women were just totally tired of, you know, having too many. I mean, you know, there's a chapter in Uganda here where family planning people are teaching a local hospital how to insert IUDs. And what they would do in the maternity ward was they would ask a very simple question of a woman when she had a baby, oftentimes her 5th or 6th or 8th. They say, does this baby make you more joyful or does it make you more worried? And if the woman expressed worries, they say, you know, there is something that we can offer you so you can not have any more children until you're ready to, and then we can undo it. And they were getting very, very high acceptance. By the way, I just wanted to say one thing about that school system in Pakistan. I asked one of the founders, I said, well, you know, schools for girls, what about the Taliban? He says, well, we just told the Taliban publicly, right off the bat, you want to blow up a school? Every school of ours you blow up, we promise you we will start 5 more. When I was there, they had 420 schools. They're now up over 900. You know, this is, I mean, this is happening so fast. It's very, very hopeful.
And is there a way to generalize, or was one country just too unique from the next country to talk about these younger women, the younger generation, and their view, particularly women, of course, about childbirth and population and family size?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. And I mentioned Israel and Palestine. In Palestine, Yasser Arafat, the founder of the Palestine Liberation Authority, used to say that the best weapon in our arsenal is the Palestinian womb, because women were encouraged to outpopulate the Israelis. And of course, the Haredim Jews, the ultra-Orthodox, are trying to do the same thing to be the majority. And it's this demographic derby. Yet young Palestinian women, when I talk to them, they're now living in confined spaces, partly because Israel has usurped so much territory. But they're tired of growing up in a room with 12 people in it. And the only way, Palestine, fortunately, has one of the highest levels of education in the Arab world. And the only way you get ahead is by educating your kids. So nearly every Palestinian young woman that I met, talked about only having two. And there's an interview with a girl and with her mother, and they're having a little discussion about this. I did go to Niger, probably the poorest country on earth, and it also has the world's highest birth rate. Women there are literally having babies to try to stay ahead of the Grim Reaper because so many die on them. Even so, their population is going to triple by the middle of this century unless they do something. And I talked to women there, and they just said, I would use family planning if I knew that my other children weren't going to die. But our medical services, they're just not here. And that's a terrible, vicious cycle to be trapped in.
To me, the power of this book is these kinds of stories, the narratives. And yet, of course, you do some of the math, of course. And one of the points you make that is if women, young women, reduce their childbirth by just 1/2 a baby, it has a remarkable impact on population growth.
Yeah, the context for that is that when you read the projections of population now, they're all dependent on the assumption that the availability of contraceptives in the world will remain constant. And one of the things I discovered in this book is that that's a very shaky assumption because the supply lines out there are fragile. I mentioned Uganda. Trucks break down and suddenly the birth control pill supply doesn't show up, or the Depo-Provera gets wasted by rats in a warehouse somewhere. As you women know, you miss one crucial dose, and all those good efforts are for naught. There are mainly a few Western nations, and the United States is #1, and about 4 major foundations that provide most of the funding for family planning in the world. And I'm not a member of any political party, but had the last election gone differently, the last presidential election, President Obama's opponents were very clear about wanting to cut U.S. aid through USAID for family planning in the world. And that's where the statistic comes out, and it's been corroborated by several different, at least 3 different demographic institutes that I know of, that if we provided universal, well, let me state the opposite. If the amount of contraception available were to be reduced, just 1/2 a child more per woman, we would not be headed to a rather scary figure, 11 billion, that we are headed to right now at current population growth rates by the end of the century. We'd be headed to 16 billion. But 1/2 a child less, we'd be headed back to 6 billion, which is a much more sustainable figure, and it would be those fewer people would then have fewer children proportionately, and we would be headed back towards a more sustainable equilibrium with the rest of nature. And that's why, there's a lot of things that my country uses my tax dollars for that I'm not proud of, but USAID's program has been utterly valiant. And to do this worldwide is incredibly cheap. It's been calculated at about a little over $8 billion to provide enough contraception so everybody on Earth who wanted to use it could use it. That is less than what we were spending per month in Afghanistan and Iraq during most of the past decade.
I'd like to switch gears here for a moment and ask you about your own kind of journey through this issue. In your previous book, you seem to suggest that a universal one-child policy was the right path. And yet in this book, you suggest something much more laissez-faire, maybe, is the expression. Women get educated, they get empowered, they have access to contraceptives, and the rest of the decision-making is up to them. How did you move from that beginning to where you seem to be now?
Well, I didn't actually advocate for a one-child policy, but
you saw the virtue in it.
I certainly didn't suggest that it was a bad idea. I mean, look, here's my concern about the planet right now. As I mentioned before, nothing we are doing to shrink our ecological footprint seems to be working. All of the programs that we have in place, renewable energies, systems that we have developed, we still contributed 5% more carbon dioxide last year than the year before to the atmosphere. The problem is growing. And I've written about renewable energy a lot in the past, but I've come to realize that the uptake just isn't fast enough. There are lots of groups that are impeding it. And even so, Germany is really the only country right now that seriously is trying to run most of its society on renewable energy. And they've got the best economy in the world. How can the rest of the world afford this? It probably requires some technological leaps. And at least contraception is technology that we already have. So given that I'm aware that there's now more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been for 3 million years, and back then the seas were 80 to 100 feet higher than they are today. In that same scenario, 15 million years ago, again, the seas were 80 to 100 feet higher. This, to me, is one of the fastest ways that we can bring our environmental impact down by simply limiting over the next couple of generations, because that's what it takes before the population significantly begins to drop, limiting the number of contributors to that of all that carbon dioxide. Because, frankly, everybody in this room probably likes to think of themselves as having as minimal an impact as possible, and yet we're all addicted to electricity. You know, lights are on in here, heat's on. You know, somewhere carbon dioxide is going up in the atmosphere as a result.
I'm not sure you answered my question.
Okay, so how did it? So how did I evolve? Well, wonderful. You know, I proposed looking at this topic, and then I did what journalists are supposed to do: leave yourself open to learning. And what I learned is that, again, female contraception or female education is the best contraception. You make contraception available and give women the smarts to decide for themselves, and that's inevitably what they're going to decide. Or you make it available and women just with common sense may want to use it. I mean, Thailand is a country, in fact, Iran had a very low literacy rate among females when that program started. Thailand, even lower. But again, an economist recognized that this country's never going to develop if every town and region is just swarming with children. So started offering economic incentives, microloans, etc., to women if they would consider, you know, and their families, if they would consider condom use. Went to the sex industry, one of the pillars of the Thai economy. And fortunately or unfortunately, this was coincidental with the rise in AIDS in the world. And they say, look, you guys have a business. He didn't try to make them feel guilty and tell them they were sinners. He says, you guys have a business. How are you going to run a business if your clients are worried that you're going to be making them sick? So he got them to use condoms. And today, Thailand, Buddhist country, he got the the Buddhist priest to sprinkle holy water over condoms and then faxed a picture of this to all the media outlets. They're down below replacement rate. They've got one of the best economies in South Asia. They're now considered one of the new tigers. And as a result, education is now seeping in. Women who have fewer children are getting to attend some of these programs to learn how to run their own businesses. The schools are, this stuff is being saturated into the school system now. And that convinced me.
Okay. There are experts out there, we were talking about this in the other room, who say the population is not the problem that you and others suggest, that we have a lot of ingenuity, we can think ahead of this, think our way out of it, create the technology to overcome the issues that come with a growing planet. What do you say to them?
Wow. Yeah, you know, I hear that argument a lot, that human ingenuity can solve everything. You know, and David Ben-Gurion used to say that in Israel. The British, who controlled Israel before the State of Israel was created, they determined that the carrying capacity was 3.5 million people. And Ben-Gurion said, Jewish ingenuity can make the desert bloom. We can fit more than almost twice that, 6 million people. Well, today there's 12 million people living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And it's going to be 21 million by the middle of this century. I hear that, you know, but if we don't let people have babies, you know, we might not have the next Mozart. That could be the next child who's going to be born. To which I point out, well, you know, the population was less than about 500 million when the last Mozart was born. We seem to have a critical mass to produce a lot of human ingenuity. But ultimately, ingenuity, what they're talking about is, you know, the ingenuity to solve more problems created by having more people. The biggest example of all that's constantly thrown at people who are concerned about population is, but the Green Revolution solved that problem. It showed that we could feed everybody on the planet. Now, as I think most of you know, the Green Revolution was a miracle of genetic breeding that could breed stalks of rice and wheat that held much, or could produce much more grain, more than doubled harvest. Some places increased it tenfold throughout the world. And this happened at the end of the 1960s, just before Paul and Ann Ehrlich, who had written The Population Bomb, predicted that widespread famine was going to break out in Asia because we couldn't feed everybody. As they said, unless there was a miracle. Well, the Green Revolution turned out to be the miracle. But here's what they forget, these people who constantly say that that refuted Malthus and that refuted the Ehrlichs. The founder of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's credited for saving more lives than anybody on Earth, which is true. But in his Nobel acceptance speech, he did not crow about that. He warned people that there's a paradox in food production, that the more food you produce, the more people don't die of famine, and then they live to produce more people. And they, you know, the begetting and the begetting keeps happening. And till he died in 2009, he was on the board of population groups because he told everyone constantly that population growth would outstrip food production. So what do we have today? The two places where it was tried, India and Pakistan. India is about to replace, to surpass China as the most populous nation on the earth within the next decade. And when I went to India, I met with the guy who implemented the Green Revolution in India. He's head of the Punjab State Farm Commission. And he introduced me to farmers who took me out to their villages where the wells that they dug, which were 50, 75 feet deep to water the Green Revolution plants, then had to go down deeper and deeper. And when they got to 500, and now a lot of them are below 1,000, farmers finally started giving up because they couldn't afford to keep drilling deeper and deeper. And I spent a whole day interviewing widows of farmers who had committed suicide because they couldn't afford it. And then I heard this statistic from the Punjab State Farm Union, which I corroborated with the Indian government, that since 1995, 270,000 Green Revolution farmers have committed suicide in India. And their symbolic method of choice is by drinking pesticide. The other country where it was tried out was Pakistan, and I've already told you the figures about Pakistan. So technological solutions always come with unintended consequences, and that was one.
And speaking of unintended consequences, I guess one of the other criticisms of stagnant or negative growth is, how do you have a robust economy in that kind of environment? And the country that may help answer that question is most likely Japan, I would guess.
Yeah, I went to Japan because it's the first nation on earth that has a shrinking population. Certainly the first developed nation that has one. The reason is an anomaly. Japan lost World War II, and some of you may remember that they got into World War II because they were overpopulated, and they decided they had to expand into Manchuria. Unfortunately, their reach just kept going and going. Greed does that. So they lost the war, and their economy was shattered. Well, after the war, soldiers came home, and a baby boom commenced for the same reason it commenced here. But with their economy so wrecked, people were starving. Pregnant women were literally throwing themselves in front of trains. So in an emergency measure, in 1949, the Japanese government legalized abortion. Remember, this was before birth control pills. And millions of Japanese women partook rather than watch another baby die of hunger. So now we're at a point where that last overgrown pre-World War II born generation is now passing on, and a much smaller baby boom generation is taking their place. And with high education standards, their children are having fewer and fewer babies. So Japan's population is going to drop to the point that by a little past the middle of the century, they're going to be close to their post-World War II population again. And a lot of Japanese economists are terrified by this. Mm-hmm. But I met a very visionary economist, and he's not a radical. He's with a major policy institute. His name's Akihiko Matsutani, who wrote a book about shrinking economics. And I spent a day talking to him, and he sees it as an opportunity. First of all, it's inevitable, because Japan doesn't, for reasons that you probably all understand, they don't invite a lot of immigrants in to shore up the labor force the way that European countries do. So their population is going to drop. It's dropping so fast now that even if they suddenly reversed that and brought in a lot of immigrants, it would still be dropping. They couldn't absorb 24 million immigrants overnight. He sees it as an opportunity to come down to a sustainable size, to come down to reality, in that he envisions an economy that is no longer focused on these crowded port cities where they can import raw materials and create a lot of export goods and send them across the ocean, but an economy where, first of all, people are going to move back inland, and I follow young people who are already doing this because land and housing is coming cheap as this overgrown old generation dies off. And he said industries will follow these workers because workers are going to be very dear, so wages aren't going to drop, which is kind of nice. And by the way, when you hear economists talk about how you need to have big populations for a healthy economy, oftentimes what they're really talking about is they want wages to stay cheap. The more people you have, poor people fighting each other over bad salaries, the happier they are. And that stinks. He also said that the idea that you constantly hear that, oh, we're going to have all these old people and just a few people in the labor force to support them and to pay in the Social Security rolls. I mean, first of all, that's going to last for about a generation and a half. And then the numbers are going to even out again as that last overgrown generation dies off. Plus, he said, senior citizens, given our health care today, are much more economically productive past former retirement age, whereas kids, I mean, they're not economically productive. They cost a lot of money. We have to build schools for them and all this stuff. So he says the problem is going to be much less than we think it is. He says, plus it's going to happen gradually. It'll happen over a few decades, a couple of generations as population comes down to size. And the economy will adjust to having lighter industries for domestic consumer goods. He says people will have to save more money, and that savings will be a way of financing public works. So there's going to be nice parks and all sorts of things that people can all share. And I asked him about investment, and he said, well, investment will be really kind of what we're already starting to do. He says we won't have a stock market so much with these incredible profits that you can make overnight, but then incredible busts after that. But we'll have what we call perpetual bonds. He says, in effect, Japan already has that. We're never going to pay back our debt, just like we're never going to pay back our debt. But you keep paying interest on that debt, and life goes on.
I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you could let us know who you are, and if you're here representing an organization, that would be helpful too. Yes. And wait for the mic, please. This gentleman right here.
I'm probably the least qualified person in the room to ask this question, being the father of 5 children. But I'm Jim Greenberg. I'm on 3 Grameen Foundation boards around the world and have lived all around the world, and much of it in developing countries for more than half my life. The old economics dictum that everything responds to incentives. My own homespun dictum that people in societies don't change until they have to. There's this, if you wait until societies have to change, it's almost too late. I mean, the damage is almost irreversible by that time without some significant, huge, quick adjustments around the world. But on the incentive side, it seems to be up to the responsibility of governments, either from a disincentive side or a disincentive standpoint or a positive incentive standpoint. Even Iran, there was aspects of that that was a government-led initiative. Do you have any comments about that in terms of how quickly are governments beginning to recognize the contradictions of a economic growth model that we have in the United States versus a long-term sustainability model?
Deplorably slow. I really haven't seen many examples in the world. Everybody points to Bahrain, but I've never worked there, so I don't really know up close what it's like. Kerala province in India was shown to be the place where everybody had a dignified existence and were highly literate, even though per capita income was very low, and partly because they were the first province in India to institute family planning, and they took an astronomically high rate of fertility rate and brought it down below replacement faster than anybody in South Asia. But it's potentially corruptible. Unfortunately, I show in the book how so many Keralans are now going over to Dubai and working in construction and making so much more money and coming back, and now suddenly conspicuous consumption is all over Kerala. This is a hard one. I don't know how to solve those problems. I certainly wish I do. The one thing that I focused on in this book is something that we don't need governments to decide. The best thing that a government can do is simply make contraception available and give people the opportunity to make a good choice. Matsutani, I was there right after Fukushima. And it was really funny because I got interviewed by a very big Japanese business magazine because my Japanese publisher arranged that. I'm not going to state the name of it because it would be embarrassing. Because the guy kept saying to me, he said, don't you think it's hysterical that the Japanese people want to end nuclear power in Japan because of Fukushima? And I said, well, given that most of your reactors are either in seismic zones or on coastlines vulnerable to tsunamis and typhoons, I wouldn't call that hysteria. And he said, yeah, but if productivity drops, they're going to suffer even more. Wouldn't you call that hysterical? And I said, you know, and he kept rephrasing his question throughout our interview, hoping for a more satisfying answer, until about the fourth time, before I could reply, the room shook because an earth tremor hit central Tokyo, you know, rendering my reply unnecessary. Now, that same magazine, he showed me, Matsutani showed me this article about how they're going to rebuild all the ports after Fukushima, the fishing ports. And he tries to explain to them, he says, look, that's going to take 20 years, and by then, only a quarter of the fishermen will still be alive because population is dropping. So why bother to do that? It's a waste. But of course, people only think about next year's contracts. They don't think about the long vision. And all I can say is my book is an attempt to help lengthen our vision.
Is there a question on this side? Okay. In the back?
Thank you. My name is Lou Ziska. I'm a research scientist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and I do research on global climate change and food security. And many of the issues that you touched on are certainly very relevant. One other issue that I also bring to folks who ask me, well, there are all these really neat technological fixes to the issue of food production, is that there really aren't. The simple fixes that were put in place with the Green Revolution were done so in order to take advantage of at that time cheap water and cheap fertilizer, or cheap energy, if you will, because it takes a lot of energy to make fertilizer. We don't have that. In addition to which, the funding, the R&D funding that goes into publicly funded agricultural research has dropped every single year to the point where it's, you know, it's not even, I think the term is budget dust. We have, to give you an example, a personal example, 10 years ago our lab had 12 scientists in it that were all working on this issue. Now we have 3 scientists, and 2 of the 3 scientists are 63, and I'm 56. So, you know, at some point, that investment, that ability of recognition and putting the resources in to bring up the next generation, not just in population, but of technology and science to begin addressing these challenges, is one that doesn't get talked about very much, but is one I think that's essentially very critical.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, of course.
I go to the Vatican in this book for some obvious reasons, but one of them is because Pope Benedict XVI issued an encyclical in 2009, and he's called the Green Pope. He put solar panels all over St. Peter's and really had an understanding of environmental issues on many levels, except in that encyclical, when he got around to people, he just simply said, there is enough to feed everybody if we share equitably. And I went there because one of the questions I had was, well, by everybody, does the Pope mean every human being or every species on this planet? Because you know, go back to Genesis, and this is the story that's also in the Quran, that when God tells Noah that, okay, we're going to save the human race, which, by the way, God decided to eliminate because he was tired of our excesses, but then, okay, we'll start over. But he also told Noah that you have to save all the animals because we can't have a world without them. Anyhow, what they told me was they admitted that they had never really looked at the question of other species. But in terms of feeding all the people, they said the answer was transgenic plants that are being developed at the centers of the Green Revolution. The Wheat and Corn Improvement Center in Mexico and the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. So I went to both of those places. And in both places, scientists told me that, first of all, they thanked me for being there to talk about population because their founder, Norman Borlaug, was such a proponent of dealing with the issue. They told me that basically the trick that they've got up their sleeve right now is to try to hot rod photosynthesis, to try to increase it by up to 50% to increase yields even further, and maybe even give some plants enough energy to fix their own nitrogen to minimize fertilizer. Because you're absolutely right. Fertilizer is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases, both in its fabrication and when it breaks down, nitrous oxide forms, and that's our third most potent greenhouse gas after methane. They don't know if they can do it, and even if they can, it's 25, 30 years off to commercialize it. And there's going to be 2.5 billion more people by then. So, but the figure was enormous. Hans Joachim Braun, who's the head of the wheat program, took Dr. Bolog's place, said that in the next 50 years, we have to produce as much food as has been consumed in entire human history. I mean, come on, folks. We can't keep doing this.
Final question.
Sure.
Short answer, please, because we're past our appointed time.
Sorry.
No. I heard you tell an interviewer on the West Coast that you would not have devoted yourself to this book if you were not ultimately hopeful about all we've discussed. So what are you hopeful about?
I'm hopeful about a couple of things. First of all, there's great momentum in the world now for exactly what this book is about. Half the countries on this planet are either at, near, or below replacement rate now. Everywhere I went, there was real interest. I mean, I went into some very conservative villages in Pakistan where the mullahs are at least, they're learning from family planning organizations that there are places in the Quran where Muhammad says every child is entitled to 2 years of mother's milk. That means you have to space your children. And women want to do that. You can see the relief in their faces when they're told that it's okay to do that. This is something, as I mentioned before, but it bears repeating. We know how to do this, and we're getting better at it. In this book, I also describe the new male contraceptives that are coming online soon. They're already available in parts of India. It's much simpler chemistry than dealing with female anatomy. We don't need a technological leap for this. It's very inexpensive. And if you combine it with female education, good Lord. I mean, imagine having a world with all these educated females. That whole labor shortage that economists worry about in a shrinking world, those women would fill that breach very, very easily. That same demographic institute that I cited before from Vienna recently wrote a paper, and these people are good number crunchers. They estimate that if female education were universal right now, there would be 1 billion fewer of us on the planet, not by the end, but by the middle of this century. This is a win-win situation, folks, and that's why I'm still hopeful.
Okay. Thank you so much. You've written a fascinating book.
Thank
you. Peg, do you want to say a few words? No. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. I appreciate it. Thank you, Alan.